The Hunger Games series has been ever growing recently, with all of the new prequel books and the movies that go along with them. Mockingjay, the book that wrapped up the original trilogy, will always be where the series ends though. With that being said, I thought it would be interesting to go over each character and see where they ended up at the end of the series. For this video, I made the decision not to cover anyone who died in any of the Hunger Games, which includes what Finnick called the 76th Hunger Games, because honestly, I think that would just get repetitive. Instead, I'm going to go over characters that survived all 3 Hunger Games and who played a part in the ending of the franchise. I did a similar video to this with Harry Potter, and it did really well, so with all of the Hunger Games hype, I thought, let's do it with this series. If you enjoy this video, please consider liking and sharing. It will greatly help the channel with the algorithm. And if you like what you see, hit that subscribe button, and you can also follow me on all of my other social medias, all of which are linked down below, and all of which house similar content that I make here on this channel. Now that I've said that, let's get into it. We'll start off with the main character in the series, Katniss Everdeen. After Katniss killed Alma Coin in a display for everyone in the country to see, she was not convicted of murder due to the insanity plea. She ended up going back to District 12 where she lived with Haymitch and Peeta. Katniss decided to create a book that highlighted everyone who had died, incorporating facts about each person that was close to her. Katniss fell back in love with Peeta, and their love for one another returned and grew stronger than ever. It took 15 years for Katniss to be in a place where she could bring life into this world, and she and Peeta eventually had children together, one girl and one boy. The lasting effects of everything that happened were still very prevalent, and Katniss continued to have PTSD for the rest of her life. She feared the day when her children would come to learn everything that happened in school and realized that they play on a graveyard of everyone buried from the District 12 bombing. She decided though that she would tell her kids of the horrors she went through in a way that would make them braver. Next we have Peeta Mellark. Peeta needed a lot of therapy following the war, especially to treat all of the brainwashing he was put through by the Capitol. After a few months of treatment though, he was finally able to join Katniss and Haymitch in District 12. There he planted primroses and also built a house to honor Katniss' sister who had not made it. Peeta also helped with the book Katniss made, using his artistic ability to add illustrations. Peeta was not entirely cured of the brainwashing, still having episodes every once in a while, but other than that, it was clear that he had returned to his former self. As I said, Katniss and Peeta mended their relationship and fell in love, and Peeta played one last game of Real or Not Real, where Katniss said her love for him was real. Peeta wanted kids very badly, but he waited until Katniss was ready, which again, as I said earlier, took 15 years. Peeta spent the rest of his life being a partner to Katniss and a father to his daughter and son. Next character is Cinna. Cinna was beaten by peacekeepers during an interrogation, which took place right when the Third Quarter Quell began. Though he was gone, his legacy lived on much longer than his time on Earth. He had expected his death following his rebellious Mockingjay dress, and thus he created designs for Katniss' Mockingjay uniforms for the future rebellion. He left a note for Katniss in there, which said, "I'm still betting on you." This was his way of telling Katniss that he was part of the rebellion all along. But at his request, he ensured that she did not know this until she agreed to take on the role as the face of the rebellion, not wanting to sway her decision. After that, we have Effie Trinket. Following Coin's death, Effie returned to her home in the Capitol, taking herself out of the fight, not wanting to be a part of the Capitol's corrupt system, nor to be a part of the rebellion. As such, she never said goodbye to Katniss, Peeta, or Haymitch, those she once considered to be her family. In the film, she had a very different ending, actually saying goodbye. But for this video, we're going by the books, not the films, and in the books, those scenes never happened. Effie most likely did not say goodbye to Katniss, Peeta, and Haymitch because it was too painful. And speaking of Haymitch, next we have Haymitch Abernathy. Haymitch ensured that Katniss was not prosecuted for Coin's murder, and following her killing, he ensured that Katniss took care of herself, forcing her to eat, drink, and take her medicine. Clearing Katniss was the last thing he did in government though. He decided that working in the government was not for him, and he instead returned home to District 12 alongside Katniss and Peeta. Mrs. Everdeen, Katniss' mother, actually made Haymitch Katniss' legal guardian until she turned 18, as she herself did not return to District 12. Haymitch helped contribute to Katniss's memory book, adding all of the tributes he had mentored over the years. Haymitch continued to drink, but he stayed busy by raising geese. Following Haymitch, we have Primrose Everdeen. Prim became a healer despite the fact that she was 1 year too young to do this, and while on duty, she lost her life during the bombing outside Snow's mansion. Her death made her a martyr and was the driving force for Katniss to kill Coin, the real person responsible for the bombing, which Katniss saw as an act that avenged Prim's death. As I said earlier, Peeta honored Prim by building a house in her name and planting primroses in their garden to help keep her memory alive. After that, we have an interesting ending with Gale Hawthorne. Gale's involvement with the bomb that killed Prim destroyed any chance he had at a relationship with Katniss, telling her that nothing he had to say about the bombing would make her feel better, basically incriminating himself. While Peeta moved to District 12 to be with the woman Gale once loved, Gale moved on by getting a fancy job in District 2. Katniss guessed that Gale found another woman there and was kissing another pair of lips. Katniss's final thoughts on Gale were that he was kindled with rage and hatred, which is something that she wanted no part of. Next is Mrs. Everdeen, the mother of Katniss and Prim. The loss of her youngest daughter greatly affected Mrs. Everdeen, and she could not bear to go back to District 12 with her oldest daughter because it was too painful. She instead moved to District 4 to head up a new hospital there, offering her skills as a healer. She saw Haymitch before he went to District 12 and told him to pass on a note to Katniss. The note had a phone number, and when Katniss called, the two mourned Prim's death together. On that phone call, Mrs. Everdeen also told Katniss that she was passing the responsibility of her on to Haymitch, who she made Katniss's legal guardian until she turned 18, which I of course mentioned earlier. Next is Madge Undersee. Movie fans might not know who Madge is, considering the fact that she was completely omitted from the films. But she was the mayor's daughter who Katniss was pretty close with, and in the book, she was the person that gave Katniss the Mockingjay pin. Madge was in the mayor's house when the Capitol bombed District 12, where she, along with many others, died. When Katniss returned to the aftermath, she was horrified at the thought that she could be breathing in the ashes of her fallen friend. Now, I know I said I was not going to include anybody that died in any of the 3 Hunger Games, but I can't skip over Finnick Odair. Finnick was killed when faced with the Mutts in the Capitol, and Katniss took him out of his misery by dropping a bomb on him and the Mutts. His wife Annie kept his memory alive though, first voting in the name of Finnick not to continue the Hunger Games following the war. And his memory continued even further, as Annie gave birth to their son who looked just like his father. When Katniss and Peeta made their book, for Finnick's page, they added a photo that Annie had sent to them, which depicted herself and Finnick's baby. Next, you might love her, you might hate her, and I'm of course referring to Johanna Mason. After the bombing in the Capitol, Johanna voted to keep the Hunger Games going with the Capitol's children to give them what they deserved. Earlier, Johanna was not approved to participate in the 76th Hunger Games, but before everyone headed out, she made Katniss swear that she would kill President Snow. Katniss of course did not end up doing this though, instead killing Coin, betraying the promise that she had made to Johanna. Johanna never got a chance to confront Katniss about this, as they never talked again, meaning Johanna's view of Katniss was not good after they had spent so much time building up a nice friendship. Johanna had a severe addiction to the drug morphling, and she had terrible PTSD from the Capitol's torture, making her break down whenever she was around water, both of which she presumably had to deal with for the rest of her life. And after that, we have Beetee Latier. Beetee helped develop the bomb that was dropped at the Capitol, killing hundreds of people, including Prim. He would presumably have to live with this guilt, which might be one of the reasons why he voted against continuing the Hunger Games with the Capitol's children. After that, we have the only career tribute who survived, that being Enobaria. Enobaria escaped the 75th Hunger Games when the Capitol took her out of the arena, but unlike Peeta and Johanna, she was released because she was from District 2, a district more favorable to the Capitol. Despite this, she was brought in to decide if the Hunger Games should continue, and she voted in favor of it. However, this didn't end up happening following Coin's death. Next, we have the mastermind himself, Plutarch Heavensbee. Plutarch was a master in propaganda, and he had a hand in many of the things that wrapped in the series. He was the one who came up with the idea of framing Snow for the bombing that the rebels were responsible for, which of course ended the war. And while that was using his skill for propaganda in a bad way, he also used it in a good way, as he swayed the country's perception of Katniss, painting her as a disturbed and insane soldier who did not deserve to be locked up or executed for her crimes. He was actually so proud of this that he smiled when telling Katniss the result of her trial. Caesar Flickerman is a character that I thought I had to mention, despite the fact that his fate is kind of up in the air. There were reports that Suzanne Collins, the author of the series, revealed that Caesar was spared following the war. However, all of these reports are fake news. Suzanne Collins never revealed his ultimate fate. After that, we have one of the sweetest characters in the series, Annie Cresta, or Annie Odair. Annie lost her husband Finnick, but as I mentioned earlier, she was blessed with a son that kept Finnick's memory alive. Annie was another person involved in deciding whether or not to keep the Hunger Games going, and she strongly said no and added that Finnick would say the same thing if he was there. Annie moved back to District 4 to raise her and Finnick's son, and she sent a picture of the two of them to Katniss and Peeta, which, as I said earlier, was a photo that ended up in their book. Now, the fate of the villain of the series, Coriolanus Snow. Coriolanus was framed for the bombing that swayed the public's view of both him and the war. This led to his execution, but before that, he was able to have a conversation with Katniss where he revealed the truth. This manipulation led to Katniss sparing him, but his death was inevitable. Though the arrow did not take his life, he was killed either by choking on his own blood when laughing at what he had convinced Katniss to do, or he was beaten to death by the swarm of citizens that engulfed him following Coin's death. And going from one president to another, we have President Alma Coin. It became clear to many people that Coin did not plan to change the country, but simply take Snow's place, even trying to continue the Hunger Games. Katniss realized this, and realized that she was the main reason why Prim had died, so Coin's life was taken when the arrow that Katniss had fired ended up in her chest rather than in Snow's. Now we get to the fate of Coriolanus Snow's cousin, Tigris Snow. Tigris loved her cousin Coriolanus, or as she called him, Corio. They grew up together, and they were best friends. However, somewhere down the line, she began to despise him. She despised him so much that she joined the rebellion to help take him down. She also helped Katniss' squad, and she ensured that they were on the path to take her cousin down once and for all. She had so much hatred for Coriolanus, or Corio at this point, that she smiled at the thought of his death when Katniss told her she was going to kill him. Taking that into account, she presumably was pleased on the day of her cousin's death. Next is Peeta Mellark's family. The Mellark family were in District 12 the day of the bombing, and Peeta's mother, father, and two older brothers were killed. Mr. Mellark ended up in the book that Katniss and Peeta made, as they wrote down how he had helped Katniss' family when she left for the 74th Hunger Games. Speaking of the 74th Hunger Games, next is the game maker for those games, Seneca Crane. Crane played a much larger role in the movies than he did in the book. In fact, he was barely even in the book. However, in both renditions of the story, he was murdered on Snow's orders. Later on, his death was referenced. During Katniss' session in front of the game makers for the 75th Hunger Games, she hung a dummy up with a rope around its neck, which said across it, Seneca Crane. Next, we have Peeta's stylist, Portia. Portia was the equivalent of what Cinna was to Katniss, though they were not as close. Following Peeta's rescue from the capital, Snow struck back with a punishment, which involved Portia and her prep team being publicly executed, aired on live television for the whole country to see. And speaking of prep teams, let's take a look at Cinna's team, which included Flavius, Octavia, and Venia. After Cinna's death, they were put through a lot. First mourning their leader, then being locked up in terrible conditions while in District 13 where they were underfed and stripped of most of their clothes. Fortunately, they were eventually found by Plutarch, who freed them, but they were still in pretty bad shape. In the end though, they all survived the war. After that, we have Greasy Sae. Greasy Sae had a much larger role in the films, being the one who gave Katniss the Mockingjay pin, which as I said earlier was actually Madge Undersee in the book. Greasy Sae, along with her granddaughter, were 2 of the 800 people that escaped District 12 before the Capitol bomb did, and they then resided in District 13. There, Greasy Sae worked in the kitchen, but following the war, she and her granddaughter were one of the few hundred people who returned back to District 12. Upon arriving, she and her granddaughter took care of Katniss, stopping by every morning and every evening to cook for her, as well as do some light housekeeping. Next is the director, Cressida. Cressida was one of the few who survived what was referred to as the 76th Hunger Games, even though she lost most of her team. Following that ordeal, she continued to direct. She had one project where she went back to the districts, and there she filmed the wreckage of the war. And the only member of Cressida's team to survive was the Avox Pollux. Pollux had to deal with the loss of his brother Castor, who died during the 76th Hunger Games, but Pollux stayed busy by helping Cressida as he joined her when going to the districts to film. Next is one of the most brutal endings to any character in the series, and I'm of course referring to Darius. Darius, a former peacekeeper who was enslaved for trying to save Gale from his whipping, was locked up, made an Avox, meaning they cut his tongue out so he couldn't speak, and was tortured by the Capitol in some of the most brutal ways. He was beaten, had his body parts cut off, and was questioned, but he couldn't answer the questions because they had made him an Avox, meaning he couldn't speak. Him not speaking led to the Capitol giving him a slow, painful death as they continued to torture him. And a character with a similar fate is Lavinia. Lavinia was another person punished by the Capitol who also made her an Avox. She too suffered the fate of being tortured, beaten, and eventually killed. And finally, we have Bonnie and Twill. These were 2 district girls, a student and a teacher, who tried to escape and find District 13. On their way, their paths crossed with Katniss, and they told her their plan. However, when Katniss arrived in District 13 herself, there was no record of them, meaning they were either captured, killed, or just died from the journey. And that is the fate of every Hunger Games character. Again, if you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and sharing to help grow and sustain the channel. That's all I have for you guys today though. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.